Welcome to my channel and my over-analysis video on the limit break system in Final Fantasy VII. So I made a video on the basics of the limit break system, which you can find on this link or in the description down below, and in this video I'll go a lot further when comparing the limits. So I'm not going to go over what each limit does in this video, so if you want to know more about that you can check out my other video. I'll be comparing the limits which deal pure damage, as the others aren't really comparable in this way. This is going to be a table of damage multipliers for all characters which has at least one limit with a damage multiplier, and again, if you don't know what limit hides in each cell, you can check my other video. So I've included 8 entries for Tifa because she can get yeah on her reels, and in this case, 1 yeah means yeah on the first reel and hit on the rest. Tifa 2 yeah means yeah on the first 2 reels and hit on the rest. Tifa 3 yeah means yeah on the first 3 reels, and so on. There are a lot of combinations for her, but I feel this will give a good overview of her potential. These are the multipliers for the level 1 limit. The characters are pretty even at a multiplier of around 3, but Tifa does stand out at 5.25 with Somersault and 2 times yeah. Cloud's Cross Slash, Barrett's Big Shot and Cid's Boost Jump are the best aside from Tifa. For the level 2 limit, it varies a little more, but again Tifa has the best multiplier when getting yeah on at least 1 reel. Aside from Tifa, the most noteworthy are Red 13, Stardust Ray, and Yuffie's Bloodfest at 6.75 and 6.25. These are the multipliers for the level 3 limit, and Tifa is again dominant with an up to 18.75 times damage multiplier. The other characters are quite even with multipliers of around 9, and Cloud's Meteorrain is the strongest among them at 9.75. And this is how it looks on the level 4 limits, and here Tifa again has the highest damage multiplier at 24, but getting those required 7 yeah is quite hard, especially getting it consistently. Cloud is quite close at a 22.5 times damage multiplier with the Omnislash, so to me this is the best level 4 limit in most cases. Another benefit to Omnislash is of course that it has more hits and therefore has a higher damage cap. And if anyone is thinking that Omnislash should have a smaller multiplier, that is not the case. While the damage multiplier per hit is 0.75, those hits are always guaranteed critical hits, and in practice that makes the multiplier 15 times 1.5, which is 22.5. Other noteworthy entries are Barrett's Catastrophe and Cid's Highwind, but they are pretty far behind here at around a 12 times damage multiplier. One could perhaps argue that only these 4 entries are really interesting here, since they're all more than 50% stronger than the other characters' entries. One thing to take note of when comparing limits is that damage modifiers on weapons such as the ultimate weapons don't do anything when it comes to limit breaks. For example, this means that Cid's strongest limit break weapon isn't his ultimate weapon, the Venus Gospel, but rather the Flayer, although the difference between the two is very small. Another thing to consider is that limit breaks that deal damage to all targets such as Cosmo Memory and Grain Bomb will deal 2/3 of that damage when used against multiple targets compared to used against a single target, and this applies to all such limit breaks. So moving on, in a simple comparison, which is the strongest limit damage-wise? One way of looking at it is by comparing the damage multipliers as I just did, but in reality one also has to consider strength and weapons when doing this. Nevertheless, I'm going to call this practical damage per use. So in this regard, which are the strongest limit breaks? Well, Tifa's Final Heaven with a 7 times yeah is the strongest with a 24 times damage multiplier. Cloud's Omnislash is pretty close with a 22.5 times damage multiplier, and Barrett's Catastrophe is after that at 12.5 times damage multiplier, and Cid's Highwind with a damage multiplier of 12.375. Another way of comparing them is to
look at the potential maximum damage per use. This is basically the same as the number of hits, but to achieve the maximum potential damage you basically need 255 attack and 4 hero rings used on that character. So which limits are the strongest in this regard? Well, there are 2 actually. Highwind and Angermax, which both have 18 hits and can potentially deal 180,000 damage per use. Those 2 are followed by Omnislash and Doom of the Living with 15 hits, and so on with reduced number of hits. So let's dive a little deeper into this limit break system. The amount of damage a character needs to take in order to be able to use a limit is different per character and per limit level, as is shown in this table. For example, Cloud needs to lose 46.5% of his max HP to be able to use his level 1 limit, and 107% in order to be able to use his level 2 limits. This means that in some situations, having level 1 limits can be more efficient since it can be used more than twice as often as the level 2 ones. Two of my personal favorite limits are Healing Wind for Aerith and Clear Tranquil for Yuffie, which both heal all party members for 50% of their max HP. You need to lose 66.4% of your HP to be able to use them, but with the Fury status you only need to lose 33.2%, so you can effectively heal more HP than you lose with these limits unless you're taking major hits. I really like these for a lot of my challenge runs, and Aerith has other healing limits as well, but you lose her on the first disc, so Healing Wind is the most useful in my opinion. So now I'm going to start with the over-analysis bit. So I'll be looking at the strongest limits at different bosses. And I'll include limits which are reasonable to have at a certain boss, and by this I mean you don't have to go to extreme length to get them at said boss, in my opinion. I'll look at the strongest available weapons aside from the no-slots weapons, which I won't include. For levels, I'll look at a level that is, in my opinion, pretty average for a normal Final Fantasy VII run. These might seem high to some of you and low to others, but they are the ones I went with. When it comes to strength, I'll be looking at average stat gains and no stats boosts from items such as the Power Source or equipment like the Power Wrist or the Gigas Armlet. I will include lines for getting 2 and 4 yeah with Tifa, as getting more than that is to me slightly unreasonable, at least getting it consistently. Though if you're better than me at getting them, she should be about as strong as Omnislash when she gets Final Heaven and 7 yes. Levels, strength and weapons are important because of how damage work in the game, and this is how the damage is calculated. First of all, your attack is calculated by adding the strength and the weapon attack, and this stat is capped at 255 outside of battles. The base damage is then calculated using this formula, where you take the attack and add your attack plus level divided by 32, and that is multiplied by your attack times level divided by 32. And the base damage is basically the maximum damage your character can deal with a normal hit against a target without any defense. The max damage you can deal against a specific target is then calculated by taking the multiplier, which is 1 for normal attacks, and multiplying that with 512 minus the target's defense, multiplied with the above calculated base damage. This is then divided by 16 multiplied with 512. The max damage is then multiplied with 3,841 plus a random number between 0 and 255, and that is divided by 4,096 to give you the actual damage dealt. The damage range is roughly 15/16 of the maximum damage up to the maximum damage. So now that I'm done with how damage works, these are the bosses I'll be looking at this comparison on. They are Motor Ball, Genova Birth, Materia Keeper, Demon Wall, Schizo, Carry Armor, Diamond Weapon, Life Form Hojo, Safer Sephiroth, and Emerald Weapon, and Emerald Weapon will be with and without maxed stats, and with and without using hero drinks. So first of all, I'll be looking at this comparison between the characters and the limits on the different bosses per limit use. The next boss is, as mentioned, Motor Ball, and Cross Slash with Cloud is the best, and that's mostly because he has the hard edge, and that is the strongest weapon by a margin. Tifa is close if you can get a 2x yeah somersault, and Red and Barret are about half as strong as Cloud. Now next up is Genova Birth, and with 2x yeah, Tifa is unchallenged, and that's mostly due to her getting a better weapon. The others are fairly close, and Barret passes Red and almost catches up to Cloud, and Yuffie is lost. The next boss is Materia Keeper, and the Seraph Cone makes Red 13 the strongest with Stardust Ray unless you can get a 4x yeah Meteor Drive on Tifa, where they are pretty close. The others are pretty far behind, Yuffie with Bloodfest at the top among them, and Barret and Kate are now lost with Grenade Bomb and Dice. Following that is Demon's Gate, and Tifa with Meteor Strike and 4 yeah and no misses is in the lead by a fair margin, and she's still the strongest even if she gets only 2 yeah with Meteor Strike. Red 13 with Earth Rave is outclassed now, but is still in second place because of the Seraph Comb and that the new Earth Rave is fairly powerful. Cloud gets Meteor Rain here, and he is almost as strong as Red with that. Barret with Anger Max gets quite a lot stronger and catches up to Yuffie, who now uses Doom of the Living. and Kate and Sid are pretty far behind. Following that is Schizo, and this is the first multi-target boss included, and that changes a few things. Tifa with 4x yeah and 2x hit on Meteor Strike is still in the lead however, and he is still followed by Red, but now with Cosmo Memory because of the roughly 5x damage multiplier per target. Cloud is still in third with Meteor Rain, but loses some ground to Red. Sid jumps up a few levels because of getting his level 3 limits, with Big Brawl as the stronger of the two, and he's about the same as Barret with Anger Max now. Yuffie's best is now All Creation, but she is still passed by everyone but Kate, who is now lost. Now next up is Carry Armor, and this is another multi-target boss, and this time with 3 targets. And this time Cloud is the strongest since Omnislash isn't too unreasonable, and now followed by Tifa with Final Heaven and 4x yeah, who also has her ultimate weapon available now. Red is fairly close to Tifa with Cosmo Memory, about the same as the 2x yeah Final Heaven. Yuffie comes next again with All Creation, and Barret now uses Catastrophe instead of Anger Max, but he has a pretty weak weapon, so he doesn't gain too much. Sid is still using Big Brawl, but he is relatively weak at this point. Kate is still dead last. Moving on to Diamond Weapon, and we're back to single target, and Cloud is still the undefeated champion with Omnislash. 4x yeah, Tifa with Final Heaven is still in second place, but the next character on the list is now Sid due to getting High Wind and the Venus Gospel. Barret is close to Sid now, but he still needs a stronger weapon. Both Yuffie and Red drop off a bit and go back to Doom of the Living and Earthrave since it's now a single target boss. Kate is still lost. Lifeform Hojo comes up next, and there's only one major change here, so Cloud is still number 1, and Tifa with Final Heaven and 4x yeah is still number 2. Barret jumps up to 3rd because of getting the missing score, and is now stronger than Sid with High Wind. Next up is the final boss, Safer Sephiroth, and as you can see there are very few changes here. Sid with High Wind almost catches up to Barret with Catastrophe, but other than that everyone just gets a little stronger. Moving on to the Super Boss Emerald Weapon, and in a normal fight without hero drinks or maxing stat, the only change is that Sid again loses some ground, but higher levels does mean more damage overall. So still at Emerald Weapon, but this time we have used 4 hero drinks, and it gets more interesting here. Both Barret with Catastrophe and Sid with High Wind closes in to Cloud, but Cloud is still the strongest by a fair margin. Because Tifa has only 7 hits, she is passed by both Red and Sid, and she is almost caught up by Yuffie with Doom of the Living. Also, it no longer matters if you get any yeah with Tifa, so you might as well go with all hits. Red 13 is now only stronger than Kate, who is dead last. Now, if we go to a setting where we have maxed our stats, max level, and use 4 hero drinks, Sid with High Wind and Barret with Anger Max are now the strongest, because they have the most number of hits at 18. Yuffie catches up to Cloud since they both have 15 hits with Doom of the Living and Omnislash. Red, now with Stardust Ray and 10 hits, passes Tifa, who still only has 7 hits. Kate's dice is pretty useless now, but it can still be quite useful if you switch the slots and try to get some of the more useful effects on that. So what limit is the strongest does vary a bit depending on when you get different limits and weapons. For example, if you get Omnislash for Cloud when it's first available on disc 1, he will dominate until you reach max strength and hero drink usage. When you get different weapons will also matter as they do increase damage, and the lower your level is, the greater the effect from the weapon is. Another way of looking at it is by going per HP% lost rather than per use. As mentioned, each character has different percentage of HP loss until a limit can be used per limit level, and this can lead to some interesting results in my opinion. Now, assuming that you can use your limit as soon as you've taken enough damage isn't exactly realistic, so instead I look at it per HP% lost plus a fixed value of 20%. That 20% is just some number I thought was kind of appropriate, and the more HP% lost you add, the closer you get to per use graphs I was going over earlier. And what I mean with this extra 20% is that, for example, Cloud's level 1 limit will be usable after losing 66.5% rather than 46.5% of his max HP, and level 2 at 127.6 rather than 107.6, and so on. So looking at it like this, we again start with Motorball, and starting out we have Cloud with Cross Slash and Tifa with Somersault and 2x yeah in the top, and the others are pretty far behind with Barret in 3rd. Next up is Genova Birth, and Tifa with Somersault and 2x yeah has 1.5 times the damage of the second best. Cloud with Cross Slash and Barret with Big Shot are now even in 2nd place, and Red with Sledfang and Yuffie with Greased Lightning are pretty far behind them. Following that is Materia Keeper, and Tifa's strongest is now a tie between Somersault with 2 times yeah and Meteor Drive with 4 times yeah. But Red jumps up to the top position due to getting Stardust Ray and the Seraph Comb, which is a lot stronger than the other weapons at this point. The rest are pretty even. Cloud is still on Crosslash and Barret on Big Shot, even if their level 2 limits are available, and Kate starts out just below those two. Following that is Demon's Gate, and 2 times yeah with Somersault is still tied with 4 times yeah Meteor Drive as Tifa's strongest when looking at it like this, and she is in first place. Red drops down due to the others catching up a bit in the weapons department, but is still second with Earthwave. Cloud switches to Meteor Rain, and Barret switches to Anger Max, but they don't gain too much from it. And the same is true for Yuffie with Doom of the Living. Kate jumps up a bit due to passing level 30, and he is now stronger than Sid, who is lost. Next up is Schizo, and this is again the first multi-target boss, but Tifa with 2 times yeah Somersault or 4 times yeah Meteor Drive is still in first place. Red's strongest against Schizo when looking at it like this is Earthrave rather than Cosmo Memory, which was in the per use bit earlier, and he is in second place. Cloud with Meteor Rain, Barret with Anger Max, and Sid with Big Brawl are pretty close to each other and Red. Yuffie has Doom of the Living as her strongest at this point, and is only slightly stronger than Kate, who is still lost. Carry Armor comes next, and even if there are 3 targets, Cloud with Omnislash is now the strongest, followed by Tifa with 2 times yeah Somersault or 4 times yeah Meteor Drive. Red, now with Cosmo Memory, is however pretty close to Tifa. Yuffie, now with All Creation, is in 4th place. Barret switches to Catastrophe and is not too far behind Yuffie. Sid's strongest is now the multi-targeting limit Hyper Jump, but he is only stronger than Kate. Tifa with All Hits now uses Final Heaven, but is still pretty far behind her other options. Following that is Diamond Weapon, and we're back to single target, so Cloud is still in first place, and he is still followed by Tifa with either 2 times yeah Somersault or 4 times yeah Meteor Drive. Sid is now in third with High Wind, but he is closely followed by Barret with Catastrophe. Red is back to Earthrave, and Yuffie is back to Doom of the Living, and they are placed in that order. Kate is still lost, but he is a little closer to the others since Dice pierces defense. Next up is Lifeform Hojo, and Cloud is still first by a large margin, and Tifa with 2 times yeah Somersault or 4 times yeah Meteor Drive is still in second place. Barret with Catastrophe comes fairly close to Tifa due to getting the missing score, and Sid with High Wind comes next, and he's only slightly stronger than Red and Yuffie. Red and Yuffie are again even, but fairly weak compared to the best ones, and Kate is again lost. On Safer Sephiroth, everyone gets slightly stronger, but there are no other major changes. Sid with High Wind closes in a little bit to Barret with Catastrophe. Yuffie and Red are now slightly stronger than Tifa with Final Heaven and All Hits. Now moving on to the Super Boss Emerald Weapon, and in a normal fight there are again no major changes compared to Safer Sephiroth aside from an overall damage increase. Tifa with Final Heaven and All Hits passes Yuffie and Red and catches up to Sid. Now when we use 4 hit rings, it gets a little interesting again. Cloud with Omnislash is still the strongest, and Barret with Catastrophe is now in second place, and he is now closer to Cloud than before. Sid is in third place and is still on High Wind naturally. Yuffie and Red are in 4th and 5th, and Stardust Ray is strongest now for Red, while Yuffie keeps Doom of the Living. Tifa drops down from second strongest to second weakest, and her strongest is now Final Heaven. It also no longer matters if you get any yeah. Now when we have maxed our stats and maxed our level and used 4 hero drinks on the party, the best limit per HP lost plus 20% is Barret with Anger Max, and he's followed by Sid with High Wind, and Yuffie, where Yuffie gets a major boost to her Doom of the Living. Even Red with Stardust Ray passes Cloud with Omnislash, and this is the first time that Omnislash really drops off since you got it. Tifa is pretty far behind, still having 2 times yeah Final Heaven as her strongest. And Kate is still dead last at this point, but again, he can be quite useful with slots. So again, it varies quite a lot depending on where you are in the game and which limit you have available to you at each boss, but Tifa is generally the strongest until you get Omnislash for Cloud. And if you for example save limits for bosses, that will also change how relevant this comparison actually is. So that is it for the character comparison. Now it's time to dive a little deeper and look at the comparison between the limits of each character, starting with Cloud. I'll be looking at this in the same way as before, damage per HP% lost plus a fixed value of 20%, as looking at it per limit use is basically the same thing as comparing the multipliers I went over before. So this is how Cloud's limits look when comparing them in damage per HP% lost plus 20%. Until you get Meteor Rain or Omnislash, the most effective limit against a single target is Crosslash followed by Braver. So using the level 2 limits isn't really worth it for Cloud, aside from learning them to get Omnislash, which is by far the strongest. It's also a little interesting how close it is between Meteor Rain and Cross Slash, even though the multiplier for Meteor Rain is so much greater. If you, however, compare them per use, it's quite a different story, but just look at the multipliers for that. When looking at a 4-hero ring fight against Emerald Weapon, the multi-hitting limits pull away by a large margin, however. Next up is Barret, and again, his first limit, Big Shot, is the strongest limit when looking at it like this until you get Anger Max and Catastrophe. Notably, Grenade Bomb and Satellite Beam are the weakest among them, aside from in the fight against Carry Armor with 3 targets, and neither Anger Max nor Catastrophe are much more effective than Big Shot. When we throw in a few hero rings and maximize stats into the mix, the multi-hitting limits naturally pull ahead, with Anger Max as the strongest with maxed out stats. Now looking at Tifa is a bit special because of the way her reels work. In these graphs I'm going to assume that one never misses, and first is going to be a comparison between when you get only normal hits. Except having Meteor Strike and Final Heaven, using the level 1 limit with both hits is the most efficient, though it is tied with Meteor Drive in the first spot, but they are not too far behind the other two either. Once you approach max stats and you start using hero drinks, Somersault is actually the second strongest overall and is basically as strong as Final Heaven. Now if you're like me, you can maybe get Ye on the 4 first reels reliably. When getting Ye on these 4 first reels, 2 with Somersault naturally, it looks a little different. Somersault is still the strongest here, but it is tied with Meteor Drive and is closely followed by Final Heaven. When you get into Hero Drink and max stats, the graph is identical to the earlier all hits graph. If you're not like me and can get 6 and maybe even 7 Yeas reliably, then Final Heaven and Meteor Strike are the best, except when using hero drinks with and without max stats, where it is the same as the previous ones. For Red 13, Sledfang is decent, but not as good as some of the earlier level 1 limits. It is barely less efficient than Cosmo Memory at lower levels, and it passes it when reaching level 60 to 70. Cosmo Memory is the strongest against Carry Armor with its 3 targets, and it is on par with Stardust Ray and Earth Rave against Schizo. The best limits generally are Earth Rave and Stardust Ray, which are quite even, with Earth Rave being slightly stronger. Though when using hero drinks, Stardust Ray passes it, and if you also max out your stats, Stardust Ray will be a lot more efficient. Yuffie is similar to Red, where the level 1 Grease Lightning is decent, but not as good as level 1 for Cloud, Barret and Tifa. Doom of the Living is always the strongest on single target bosses, but it is fairly closely followed by Bloodfist. All Creation starts out decent and is on par or better than Doom of the Living against 2 targets or more, but it drops off a bit towards the end of the game. The other 2 limits, which hits all targets, are decent and more effective than All Creation towards the end of the game. With hero drinks, the difference between the multi-hitting ones and the one-hitters is quite astounding, and the All Creation being the weakest at that point. For Sid, the level 1 boost jump is again decent, and it is the strongest until you get level 3 or higher, unless you're hitting multiple targets. Highwind is the best as soon as it's available, due to having the highest multiplier and the greatest number of hits, though the level 3 ones are pretty close. Nothing changes much when using hero drinks, but maxing stats and using hero drinks will let Highwind leave the rest of them in the dust. So in conclusion, the difference between the limits may seem greater than they actually are, depending on how you look at it. And for several characters, the level 1 limits are actually better than the level 2 limits in terms of damage done per HP lost, which is kind of interesting, in my opinion. That is it for my little video on the limit break system in Final Fantasy VII, and if you've enjoyed this, feel free to like the video and subscribe, as that can help keep me motivated to make more of these style of videos. Yeah, that's it for this one, so until next time, have a good time.